Human resources, human capital, people, and culture. This single vocation has many names. HR professionals are responsible for what is arguably the most critical success factor within any organization. It's talent. HR Studio Podcast brings you bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond. Listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. For over 35 years, AJO has built its reputation on experienced listening, exceptional quality, and caring partnerships, delivering services in 30 states and 20 countries. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com and be sure to check out our top-ranked HR blog and sign up to receive email alerts while you're there.
So welcome everyone to HR Studio Podcast. My name is Fred Bunsa. I'm your host for today's episode. And I'm excited to be joined by John Storm. John is from Oklahoma, and John's the founder of BrainStorm Network. He works with people who help bring their ideas to life. John is a professional brainstormer, and it caught our attention. He offers innovative solutions around facilitation, training, consulting, and speaking, all around this idea of brainstorming and mostly around innovation, helping companies innovate. It's a huge topic, John, that companies are talking about all the time. We thought it would be tremendous to have you on the podcast to talk about how companies can do that better, and specifically with some of the HR teams that we work with around what's involved with that. So welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Fred. Glad to be with you.
So let's start with some of the basics. What do you consider to be innovation? When you're talking to clients and organizations about that, what do you say?
Well, Fred, that's a great question, because innovation really is many things, and that's kind of the problem too, because it means different things to different people.
Okay.
Most people see innovation as a positive thing, where you're talking about growth and good change and progress. But a few people see it as negative because it's a disruption to their comfortable status quo, or it's an enemy to their way of the life or values or how they make a living. So, unfortunately, in innovation, there are often winners and losers. And, an example, the challenge is that one person's innovation is another person's curse. For the blacksmith that was making horseshoes, the automobile was a curse. For the factory worker, they see the robot and automation as a threat. And, lately, the long-haul truck drivers, they see innovation of autonomous vehicles as a career death threat. So What I try to do is identify different definitions, and I have a nice little tool that has 10 different definitions of innovation, ranging from some people thinking innovation is R&D only. Some people think of it as putting innovation in a technology box where it's about gadgets and software and their infrastructure. Other people think about it as a concept of innovation, like the process of continuous improvement, or maybe a total disruption of the status quo. But then other people just use it as a buzzword to add to their website or the mission statement.
Right.
And they don't really know, like magic dust, we're going to sprinkle it on there and hope that works. So what I try to do when I facilitate innovation processes are talk with the senior leaders. I begin by asking them to define innovation. And I remember two specific stories of when I did this. One was with a group of about 15 CEOs, and the other one was about 12 senior organizational development people. And I said, what is innovation? I had them each write this down on an index card, and then I had them read them out loud to each other. And as you probably guessed, not one definition was the same.
They were all different.
Then I asked them, I said, so how many of the people on your leadership team do you think know your definition? And then how well are they executing your vision of innovation if we don't even really have clarity around what innovation is? So most of them, they admitted that their teams probably didn't know, and that kind of kicked off a great discussion about what innovation could mean for each individual company.
And do you come in, with all your experience in doing this for these 20 years, do you have your go-to definition for innovation, or is it really defined by the organization you're working with?
Well, I go with what they have, but then I like them to wrestle with each of the definitions. I'm working with a client right now that's wrestling with this, and they tend to think it's more about technology. So the IT guy is kind of working them at it from that angle. But the HR person is saying, no, 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 we want innovation to be something everyone has access to. And so that's kind of where my definitions tend to move towards looking at innovation as the process. And I'll tell a little bit more about saying, really, it's the process of bringing an idea to life.
Okay, the process of bringing an idea to life. So that's your catch-all for what, and there's a lot of things that could fall underneath that, but that pulls it all in for what your purposes are.
Well, we'll talk about brainstorming later, but brainstorming is coming up with ideas, but innovation is actually taking ideas and actually turning them into something tangible and of value. And so that's kind of where people get confused sometimes between the two words.
Okay. So what are some of the, you talked about definitions and disagreement over definitions. Are there other obstacles that can get in the way of innovation?
Well, there's a big monster list of obstacles because if you think about anything that kind of gets in the way of a company growing. So I have a short list that I'll kind of share with you. It starts with one you're probably familiar with and heard before, and that's success itself. Because what's worked before usually can become an obstacle because that's how we did it. And I love Marshall Goldsmith's old book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, because it reminds us that sometimes we get stuck in looking at new patterns because it's been successful in the past. So that's one. Kind of tied to that is just a general category of ruts and habits and patterns and just kind of being in your comfort zone. The third on my list is just the general category of arrogance. And I use the acronym KIA for know-it-all because oftentimes people get very confident in how they've done things and they aren't necessarily open to new ways, and that's where the disruptors end up shaking them up. And yet arrogance itself is a huge, our egos are big obstacles to innovation.
Well, it seems like that would probably link back to the first one you mentioned with success, because I guess one of the reasons we can tend to be arrogant is because we've had some success, and so they can feed on each other.
Well, having an open mind is one of the most critical elements to trying to grow or innovate in anything. And so I think one of the things I've seen, though, as a big obstacle in the last few years has been the whole idea of metrics, in that we have a lot of people that are very unclear about what innovation is. So if you don't choose how you're going to measure it pretty specifically, if you don't have clarity around how you're going to measure the results, both tangible and intangible, then that screws up your idea of whether you ever hit the mark on innovation. So I see people that don't have any process or system, so that's another big obstacle. You can't just wing it. And then the last two are what I call copycat. And copycat innovation is where this happens a lot because we get fired. It usually happens when your senior leaders fly out to Silicon Valley and they go walking around, particularly when they go to the Google campus. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but I've walked around out there, and I mean, it's infectious. You just go, this is great. I want to ride this red bicycle, and I want free candy, and I want 20% of my time to work on anything I want. Unfortunately, though, many times these are like manufacturers that are trying to crank stuff out. So the idea of having flex time and all this crazy stuff that you see that's cool about Google is not usually transferable back to your specific environment. And so you have to try to find ways, if you're trying to copycat what other cool, innovative companies have done, that doesn't always transfer to you.
So you've got to copy it, but it sounds like you have to translate it into what your culture and your organization can sustain.
You bet. I mean, you may not need red bikes, and free candy bars may not fit what you need, but maybe, free barbecue once a month, or, some kind of thing that is of value to your people that fits within the way you do your operations.
Okay.
So the very last one, though, obstacle-wise, that I listed is, I'm just going to call it distraction, because there are so many shiny objects out there for all of us, the sheer amount of overwhelm that we feel, it's very difficult for us to stay focused on what's important versus what's urgent. And when it comes to innovation, it's almost even worse because innovation is about looking at all these options, and yet we get so distracted sometimes we forget that why we're even doing this in the first place, because we get in love with some cool new deal and we forget that there should be more of a systematic approach to it.
I know some of my HR colleagues over the years have talked about they dread when their leaders go away on business trips because they read those articles in the magazine on the plane, and then they come back and say, here, we need to do this. This is cool. And it can really cause a bit of a distraction in the moment from the things they've already identified as their top priorities.
You are all over that because you're trying to think, okay, how are we going to translate this to us with our budget, with our, factory setup or whatever you're doing? Mm-hmm. So one of the things to remember, though, in this whole idea about innovation is that there's this kind of natural continuum between safety and risk. So the cool thing is that, most organizations tend to gravitate towards safety, and yet ultimately that end leads to death, of stagnation. On the right side, though, you have people that are moving towards risk, and unfortunately you have people that move so far in the risk side to get so innovative that oftentimes they flame out. So my favorite example in modern, I'm going to say recent news, is Elon Musk, who, the guy is just amazing, but he's a little bit like Icarus, who flew a little too close to the sun, and all of a sudden, he's a massive disruptor and innovator, and yet he's so far on the risky side that if he doesn't carefully manage the safety side, then he might lose it all.
That's interesting. A timely topic. He's been in the news a lot lately for stepping into a few things.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, he has an amazing track record of innovating, from PayPal to SpaceX to Tesla to Solar City to the tunnels to whatever the next thing is he's working on. But if he doesn't have some infrastructure and safety built in, then that could all come tumbling down too.
Okay.
Oh well.
So what? You've identified with some of those obstacles in that continuum. You clearly identified these are tricky waters to navigate here, and you can't be too aggressive, and yet being too conservative in these areas can lead to competition passing you by. So what is it that you do to help clients navigate those things?
Well, I guess I'm kind of fascinated by glass devices. So I have 4 little devices that I use kind of as a metaphor to talk about how I help clients. The first glass device is a mirror, because sometimes I just serve as a mirror, because I hold the mirror up and reflect to them what they see about themselves by asking them some tough questions. What do you like? What do you not like? What do you want to change? And so the mirror kind of makes them get reflective about how they see themselves, good, bad, and ugly. The second glass device is a microscope, because the next stage is usually kind of dig into the details and find the facts, do research, look on a very micro view. What does your organization look like? What are we producing? What are the challenges? And then the third device is the telescope, because that's where I try to help them see into the future, into the distance, and get a vision for themselves and their future that's beyond themselves. And then the last part is kind of where the creativity comes from. I like to help them as a kaleidoscope, because the kaleidoscope helps them see things in new ways with the texture and color and patterns and combinations that you don't see in a regular lens. So, my ultimate goal is usually serving as a resource to internal leaders, my HR, a leadership team, or the CEO, by trying to use these 4 views to help them ultimately become a valued, trusted advisor to the projects that they're working on.
Interesting. And what's like the ideal way for you to engage with an organization? Is it with the line leaders, or do you work out of the leadership group? What's ideal for you that you actually see? We have a shot here of actually driving innovation. Where as our rising leaders in HR are listening here, if they've got some ideas around innovation, what's the approach to the organization? Is there a particular way that you find tends to work?
Well, although I do believe that innovation can rise from the bottom, or really in any element of the organization, if you really want to drive change, you have to kind of start at the top. From the standpoint of if you don't get buy-in for innovation as a whole from the leadership team, it's never going to get driven on down through. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't individual pockets all down below and they can do their own little things, but if the senior leadership team doesn't really buy into this idea of building a culture of innovation, it's probably not going to work. And I just did a talk here recently that I called Whose Job is Innovation? And I have a cool little chart that kind of shows all the options of who that can be, and that ranges from everybody, meaning that you are wanting to equip everyone in the organization to be able to tap into their creativity and add value to the organization, to some specific, I'm going to call them a somebody. That's where you assign a vice president of innovation or a senior innovation director. So that's somebody that's kind of leading the pack.
Okay.
The problem with that is that then everybody thinks it's their job.
It's their job, right? Yeah.
Job. So I pretty much say you kind of have to start with the senior leaders.
Okay. You had talked in our previous conversation in preparation for this about an innovation wheel design that you created. I wonder if you could talk to our listeners a little bit about that.
You bet. Well, about a year ago, I had 3 different prospects call me in a row. They all were saying, well, how do we design an innovation program? And I realized that after doing this for 15 years, I'd never really created a tool to help people do that. So I got to work and created this thing called the Innovation Design Wheel, which is to try to help people create a culture of innovation. And so what it is, it has 7 basic steps that we follow through to try to help people get clarity about what they mean about innovation, what is its value, what do we want to drive, what are the things that are going to get in the way, many of the things that I've just talked about here, but trying to help them in a systematized process to wrestle through, is this even worth it? What do we really expect? What are our time frames? I mean, are we wanting short-term, mid-term, long-term results? How long are we willing to invest in it? I mean, do we have to have it pay off in 3 months, or are we looking for a Chinese view, 1,000 years? Are we wanting to change the world, or we want to get through next quarter? So that's kind of what this design wheel is, and I give this away free because I just love being able to help people think through how do we actually figure out what this looks like in our organizations.
Sure. So it sounds like the wheel is designed not to help people innovate, but to ask the right questions to help them even decide, should we innovate, and if so, where should we innovate? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Right. It's just about trying to help them think through what innovation could or should look like at their organization. And once they kind of design that, then you can come along and say, okay, maybe our line leaders are the ones that are closest enough to it, and we need to equip them with a couple of different creativity or creative problem-solving tools to help them do their job better. Maybe it's a company-wide training where, just a series of short videos that kind of gives them some new tools and techniques to do their job. But this is really more for the senior leaders to wrestle with, what's innovation going to look like at our organization?
Okay. And have you had, how long ago did you say you came up with that?
It's just in the last 6-8 months, and really within the next 2 weeks, I'm actually going to have a short little video, and once I get that, I'll put the link on it, or I offer to send freebies here in just a minute, and I'd be glad to follow up with people with a link on that here within the next couple of weeks.
Okay. So how would somebody learn more about the kind of work that you do and how you help organizations?
Well, for you, I put together this, just a little packet I'm calling the innovation packet. And for anybody that's watching your show or listening to the podcast, if they'll just email me, my email is pretty simple, John, John, at brainstormnetwork.com. And if you'll put innovation packet in the subject line, then I'll send you a PDF that has a whole bunch of different tools in it. And be glad to chat with anybody if they have questions. But it's just a kind of free offering to say, hey, here's a sampling of some things that we might consider. And then when I get these other videos, I'm trying to build videos on everything, but right now, just these first couple of tools. As you probably know, sometimes these video projects are a mess. Anyway, I'm wrapping up a couple of those. So I'd be glad. It's John at brainstormnetwork.com.
Great. And so as we start to wrap up this episode, John, tell me, if you think about our audience of rising HR leaders, is there anything you would encourage them to think about, or any particular resources out there you would say is, if you really do want to drive innovation in the organization, I would recommend a couple steps or some ideas for them?
How about two ideas? I don't know if you remember, there was an old kid's song called Deep and Wide. And it's an easy way to remember, but one of the key lines is, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. Well, I like to think of innovation as a fountain that is flowing deep and wide. So my two thoughts for HR rising and current leaders are, one, go deep. And by that I mean, think about going deep and getting clarity about your mission, your vision, your values, and what is really driving innovation. And ask the tough questions about, are we serious about getting the most out of our stakeholders, or are we just playing around? I mean, when you go deep, you develop the clear metrics that are going to measure this, and be sure that you're looking at leading metrics, not just lagging metrics, as far as how we're going to see how this affects people's daily performance. So that's number one, go deep. Go wide means, think about, I get frustrated when people just think that only the leaders have ideas. And when I say go wide, I want you to develop strategies to maximize the input of all your stakeholders that engage both their minds and their hearts. Because if you'll help them get unstuck, you can provide them some training and tools and systems that take the buried treasure out of their brains and put them into circulation. And I think, there's lots of resources. I'm certainly willing to send you, anybody that wants, a list of some of my favorites. But basically, my favorite examples are to look beyond my own industry and find examples of innovation in other industries and look for ways to translate their business models, their trends, their super tricks that haven't been tried yet in my industry. So go deep, go wide, and I hope that helps in some way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. One last question that I had was, do you have a favorite book out there on innovation that you would just say, there's probably lots of them, but one that either you just read recently or that's always near the top of your list in terms of favorites?
Wow, that would be very hard because I'm a total book addict. So I probably have about 300 books on innovation.
Wow.
So, and I think back, one of my favorites long time ago was called The Seeds of Innovation.
Okay.
And it's a good agricultural example, but it's been out a number of years. But I mean, that's probably not fair to all the other authors that I love. So if somebody wants to email me, I could probably put a list of my top 10 books together. I used to do this, but that's probably the top one right this minute.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, thank you, John. This was a really great conversation. The pressure for us all to be innovative and to do things differently is every day we're being asked to do that. And so this topic is just so timely. We really appreciate you joining with us today. And for those of our listeners who'd like to learn more about innovation and follow our guest John and access some of the resources that he talked about, you can subscribe to the podcast. The links will be in the show notes. You can reach us at hrstudiopodcast.com, and not only will you find information about John Storm and his organization, Brainstorm Network, LLC, but also the different resources that A.J. O'Connor can bring you as well. So thank you all for listening, and we look forward to speaking again soon. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you for listening to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. To discover additional information from this week's episode and to catch up on all episodes, visit hrstudiopodcast.com. Subscribe to the HR Studio Podcast list while there and receive alerts and future updates.